Our Christmas traditions, right? They give us a little bit of direction, some grounding in the midst of all that we're trying to unpack that goes around Christmas. So, Faith Community, Merry Christmas. There you go. Yeah, last week we were coming out of like the Thanksgiving fog and all that. This time we're ready to go, right? Awesome. So glad to have you with us this morning as we just walk into this series, Unpacking Christmas, that we started last week. Isn't it remarkable for a season that talks so much about words like joy, peace, and love that we experience so much conflict? Think about the last few years. I mean, we had the pandemic Christmas where we didn't get to see the people we love. Then we had the super spreader Christmas where all the people we love infected us. And now we got the post-pandemic Christmas where we get to see all the people we didn't have to see for 2 years because we had the pandemic as an excuse. And now we're going into all these things that we were able to avoid. You know, like the office party with the people who gossip, the boss who gave you the bad review, right? Or maybe it's the neighborhood party. You're pretty sure that the neighbor who gossips about everything gossips about you when you're not standing right next to him or her. Or maybe it's the school party where you're trying to not offend anybody, and so you're not quite sure what to do, how to show up, or how to coach your kids, so you just let them call in sick that day. Or maybe it's the family party where you get that weird uncle who likes to talk about his conspiracy theories and knows how to poke your mom in just the right way to rev her up. So next thing you know, there's turkey flying and stuffing in the air, you know, and then you go, hey, that was another happy Thanksgiving, Christmas moment, right? So this is what we want to do this morning. Because you go through all that, you know what you want? You want to go back to COVID, right? You want to go back to those moments, suddenly like being separated and isolated in a quiet moment, just you and maybe the kids, kind of feels like a little appealing, doesn't it? So how do we manage conflict at Christmas so we don't feel that way? So what we feel is we feel good going into the holiday season, the Christmas season, where we get to focus and center our lives on Jesus. So this morning I want to talk about how God's presence makes it possible to manage conflict towards good results. Conflict doesn't have to end in bad results. Conflict can be the means by which we move to good results. We're going to do that because we're just going to look at a character in the Christmas story that I really appreciate, who doesn't always get a lot of press, Joseph. Well, as we unpack the story of Joseph a little bit, we're going to look about how Joseph managed conflict in a healthy relationship, and we're going to look at how he managed conflict in an unhealthy relationship. And we're going to pull out some principles that maybe you can use in your own life. And here's what might happen to you this morning. As I'm speaking, someone's name might come to mind. You might actually have a person who pops into your head. And then if that happens to you, this morning I would say that's God speaking to you. How can you take something that is said this morning and apply it in that relationship so that you could expect something good to happen? And that's what we're going to do. But first, let's pray. God, I just want to invite you into the moment. As you've been here, continue to be here. I pray, Father, that you would fill me, speak through me, do immeasurably more than we ever could expect or imagine possible. Be the God who shows up, the one that we can encounter, the one who changes us with every encounter, who does bring joy, who does bring peace, who does bring love. God, I love you so much. And so I invite you into this moment to speak through me in a way that I didn't imagine possible, exceeds my expectations, and does what I couldn't have imagined happening in someone's life. You are the living God. Amen. Let's take a look at a little bit of the story of a man named Joseph. So this is how the birth of Jesus came about. Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. So the word pledged is really important in this context. It doesn't make a lot of sense in our world, because in our world we choose who we marry. But in Joseph's world, that was probably chosen for him. His parents made an arrangement that would have been aware to the whole community. It might have been done when they were kids, so that for decade or more, he knew exactly who he was going to marry. The decision was taken off the table, and it was decided for him by their parents. It might have been done maybe a year before that, as Mary came to a place where she was ready to get married, and then Mary's parents went to find somebody. There was even a role that a member of the community played called the matchmaker, who helped two families arrange their eligible children together into a marriage. So it would have been a community-known, clearly arranged, legal arrangement for marriage. It was the beginning of marriage. It was what we call betrothal. The ceremony was the finish. It was like the period at the end of the sentence. For us, the ceremony is the beginning of it, but in Joseph's day, it was the finish of it. And there would have been a financial arrangement where Mary's parents would have given a betrothal or a bride's price, and then Joseph would have paid a little bit towards that as well. So it's kind of an interesting, there's a business aspect to it, there's a whole community aspect to it. All this is going on, and in the middle of all this, or at the midst of this, Mary was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Again, if you're in a culture that puts all this work into arranging a marriage, pregnancy is adultery. Because Mary would have gotten pregnant by one of three things. It would have been something violent that would have happened to her, and no one's claiming that. It would have been Mary and Joseph who had jumped the gun, but Joseph's not claiming that. It would have been Mary who had broke the vow. This is a devastating experience for Joseph. We know the outcome, and because we know the outcome, we're just kind of cheering on Joseph to get to the end of the journey. But in the midst of this, and at this moment, and when you read the Bible, you've got to put yourself into the world that you're reading to try to understand its impact. It's why we talk so much about study Bibles. Those are Bibles that have notes at the bottom to help us bridge our two cultures together. That for Joseph, this would have been a devastating and humiliating thing. The whole community would have known this. This would have fractured families, and it would have broken his heart as to why this would have happened. But because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. It's disgraceful. And it would have ended in what they would have called divorce. Now, it's disgraceful because what would have happened to Mary would have altered her life in such a horrible way. Joseph is a person who was betrayed. He has every right to be angry. He has every right for vengeance. He has every right to unleash on her. And if he had did everything that he could have done, most likely what would have happened is he would have broken they would have considered that she had broken the vow. He would have ended the contract. He could have kept the money that the father had given, which would have been a financial loss to her family. Mary would have been homeless unless her family would have taken her back, but her family would have felt betrayed by what had happened. At the very best, if she'd gone to her family and she was able to live in the midst of her family, she never would have remarried because she would have known as somebody who had gotten divorced by adultery. And nobody would remarry her, and she would have had to raise Jesus on her own. Sometimes in life, there are these moments where a decision needs to be made, and it's on a pinnacle, and it's swaying back and forth over one edge of hope and another edge of disaster, and that's what's going on at this moment. Mary's future is hanging over an edge, and Joseph has the power to choose what he's going to do in this moment. But Matthew wants to understand that Joseph is an extraordinary person because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law. Joseph was a very religious man. You know, there's a lot of religious people that we meet in Matthew's gospel. As a matter of fact, we've been walking through a journey of the life of Jesus Christ, and we've met some very religious people who are faithful to the law, who are cold and seem distant and less compassionate than what we might imagine for somebody. But there's a word in here, and often when we study the Bible, it's the little words that make a big difference. And the word yet is a big word in this sentence. Joseph was faithful to the law, which meant he had every right to divorce her. He had every right to shame her. He had every right to reject her. He had every right to keep the money, move on, and marry someone else. That was all in the confines of what was allowed to him at that day. And yet, he didn't want to expose her to public disgrace. Joseph was a man whose faith informed his compassion and created somebody who could look at the world through the eyes of someone who had offended him and choose to be gracious. And that's an extraordinary person, isn't it? But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what's conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She'll give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus, because he'll save his people from their sins. After he had considered this, words are important, right? The words that we choose are packed with meaning. And this one word considered is an unusual word. The Bible wasn't written in English. We talk about that here often. It was written in original languages like a form of Greek that was spoken on the streets. And that word considered is an important word. It is a word of somebody who is pulled away to carefully consider and think about his actions. In the midst of this betrayal, he has every right to respond with anger and vengeance. Joseph chooses to pull away and to think before he responds. He doesn't respond with anger or bitterness or hatred, just not his first response. His first response is, God, what are you doing here in this situation? And so he ponders. Maybe he goes back and he takes some time out, thinks through things pretty carefully. Maybe he goes to his place of worship that we call the temple, and he spends some time with priests, or he spends some time in worship. Maybe he spends some time in their local gathering, a place we call the synagogue, their faith community, where he's able to process it with some people who are religious leaders in his community who understood the Bible well. Maybe Joseph just pulled away to pray. Maybe he took some time away because this was a big deal to him. His life was changing. He had to figure out what he was going to do, and rather than react, he thought. He put his emotions in the passenger seat so that he could sit in the driver's seat and make a good decision. And what happened, because he was a man that was faithful, compassionate, and chose to think before he reacted, he put himself in a place where God could speak. An extraordinary moment when God said something that Joseph didn't expect. Mary's telling the truth. And Joseph, you have an opportunity right now to be part of something bigger than yourself. And what happens in the midst of the conflict is that Joseph could have just responded, pushed Mary away, moved on with his life, and Mary would have had to figure it out. But God was working in the scenes, because God had brought together two people of extraordinary character and deep faith, so that when he was bringing Jesus into the world, his son would be raised and guided by extraordinary people. And he brought them to the moment, and what he said to Joseph is that I'm involved in your life in a way that you don't understand and you don't expect, but I want to do something bigger through you. You're going to give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus, because he'll save their people from their sins. And so Joseph woke up and did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and took Mary home as his wife. One of the things that I love about Joseph in the story from the Bible is we read this, and really we only hit Joseph in the beginnings. There's the active verb of did. He woke up, he did. God spoke, he did. This happened, and Joseph did. Joseph was a man who put his faith into action. And so he woke up. He did exactly what God asked of him. He went back and he reconciled with Mary. What a conversation that must have been. And then he did two things which make him stand out. He chose to share her shame. In marrying Mary, you know what the world would have thought? They jumped the gun. Here's a guy who was faithful to God, trying to do the good, and by marrying Mary, he just subtly communicated to the world, what could I say? And moved on. If you're a person of strong character, for whom faith is at the center of what you do, the choice to choose to share someone's shame, though you didn't create it, is an act of sacrifice and love. Because Mary didn't create it, but she's going to experience it. And so together they carried this weight after they had reconciled, and to move forward. And it was an act of obedience to Joseph, to God, in order to choose reconciliation. Because you don't have to choose reconciliation. You can choose to walk away. But Joseph chose to engage. And he didn't consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son. And then he did exactly what God asked him. He didn't name his son after himself. He named his son Jesus. He made those decisions. Joseph is a person that you can learn a lot from when it comes to how to manage conflict in a healthy relationship. Because think about it. When you're caught into conflict, you have to figure out how you're going to respond. There's so much storm of emotion around a conflicted relationship, isn't there? The hurt, the pain, the betrayal, the anger, the frustration, the confusion. All these emotions are revving around. And we often don't expect conflict. Conflict happens to us more than we plan it or we see it coming. But what we learn from Joseph is that if you want to be prepared for conflict, then get yourself into a good place. Think about athletes. Right now it's football season, basketball season, if you like hockey, whatever it is. For every hour they're on the ice, on the court, or on the field, they've spent 10 to 15 hours preparing for that moment. They're there in the midst, preparing themselves for the unexpected. Whether it's getting into shape, learning the plays, practicing the plays, what they're doing is they're putting themselves into a place that when the unexpected happens, they're more likely going to be able to respond to it in a healthy way. Because Joseph was faithful to God from the very beginning, when the unexpected happened, he was able to make decisions in the midst of chaos and strong emotions that would guide him through that conflict towards a better end. This is where we started the whole series, Managing Your Emotions. If you missed it, go view it last week's message, so that you can be in a better place when the unexpected happens and conflict arises. And choose the gracious way. Let's see, the thing that should set Christians apart from everyone else in the world around us is that we have an understanding of grace that is deeply personal to us. We have an understanding of what it cost God to love us. A deep understanding of our own faults, failings, sins, and decisions, and the cost to God to love us. It becomes the motivation for us to choose grace because we understand grace. Not understand grace, but understand grace. And when you understand grace, it changes your emotions, doesn't it? I think that there was that in the midst of this, because he put himself into a good place and because he understood grace, Joseph could look at the world through Mary's eyes. And even though at that point in time in the story, I'm not saying that he approved of her what he thought were her decisions, or that he was justifying her decisions or excusing her decisions, he looked through it and he asked himself the question, what will she go through and what part do I want to play in that? Because in the midst of conflict, we have the choice. Do we want to continue the pain? Do we want to continue the hurt? Or do we want to be the people who blow the whistle and say, I'm stepping off the court right now? I'm going to choose to respond in an extraordinary way, because when you choose grace and you're faithful to God, his love flowing into your life gives you the ability to do something extraordinary by his love. And if you've done this, if you've got yourself into a place where you put yourself into a good place, you're choosing to put your emotions into the passenger seat, you're going to choose grace, you begin to reflect and to ponder on it, God's going to be able to speak to you in ways that you don't anticipate. He's going to be able to give you an insight into what's going on inside the situation that maybe you didn't know. Because what happens when we get angry? Our gut response is that we get angry based on all the information we have as if it's all the information that we need. Opposed to the idea that there are circumstances that you may not be aware of. There may be information that you're not privy to. There may be a reason why the person responded to that based on their life experiences that you didn't share that caused them to move that way. But putting yourself into a place where God can speak to you will provide new insights that you didn't anticipate. And then this is the thing I really do. If it's grace that distinguishes us, this is what the world sees, is our commitment to reconciliation. What did Jesus say? When we get past this, we're going to get into a section of Matthew that's called the Sermon on the Mount, and there's a whole string of sayings that start with the word blessed. And what did Jesus say? Blessed are the peacemakers, because they're going to be called the children of God. If you want to look like your Father, then commit yourself to peace. Because in Joseph's world, everyone would have encouraged him, keep the money, break off the relationship, start someone new. If she's already done this, how do you know that you're going to be able to trust her? She's blaming God. Do you understand? That's blasphemy in that world. But Joseph, working off the insights he's gained, has made the decision that I'm going to do the unexpected. I'm going to make peace, share shame, obey God, and move forward. Now, the wonderful thing in this story is that Mary is an extraordinary woman. She was chosen by God for her character. Everything that she said was true. And Joseph was able to begin to see God moving in their lives because of all the decisions that he made in the midst of this conflict, this storm of conflict. But what happens if you're caught in an unhealthy relationship? Because Joseph's story includes that too. Later on, after Jesus has been born, when the Magi had gone, so the Magi, you know, the whole thing like we three kings of Orient are, right? This is about these, and we don't even know that there were three. They were just people that had seen God moving in the world, tried to find where it was happening, and they stumbled across the king at this point, the political leader of Israel, this man named Herod, and they were looking for Jesus. And what they didn't understand is that they had set off a chain reaction in Herod's heart that was going to be disastrous and traitorous. So when the Magi had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there, I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. Herod is a real interesting figure. Herod might have been the inspiration for Game of Thrones. Herod is a guy who was paranoid, violent, and cruel, who had the ear of those in power. He was an exceptional person in history at this time for his cruelty and his violence. So when he committed himself to kill children, Herod killed children in order to preserve his position of power. What we know of Herod is that Herod actually killed a wife and killed some children that he perceived as a threat. This is how violent a man he is. This is an extremely unhealthy relationship. And so God speaks to Joseph again. He tells him in a dream, get up, take the child and mother, escape to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. And so he got up, he took the child and mother during the night and left for Egypt. That was a 90-mile journey, probably on foot. Escaping to a foreign country, looking for a community of people who shared some ethnic similarities so that he could kind of build up a new business. This was a huge sacrifice for Joseph to make. In order for Joseph to save Jesus, he had to go to another country, find some people like him that could help him, set up his business and get going again, living off the generosity of the Magi who had given him this gift so that he could keep Jesus alive. All this in the midst of an extremely unhealthy relationship. And from this, we learn some lessons. Some of us have real unhealthy, dysfunctional people in our lives. I'm talking about the type of people, when I'm saying unhealthy, I mean some of them, sometimes they're dangerous people. It could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, it could be verbal abuse. So we've got some real abusive people in our lives. Some of us got some people in our lives that maybe aren't abusive, but they're emotionally manipulative and really good at it. They're the people who know just what to say and just what to do in order to trigger a response. And, you get the weird people in your life. Some of us are caught in positions of business where we're trapped in unhealthy businesses with manipulative, powerful people who tap into us and take advantage of us, and the impact, whether it's on business or on family, washes all the way into our homes. Where we have to make decisions about patterns of behavior that we've experienced and whether or not we're going to expose our families to those patterns of behavior. And the thing about a dysfunctional relationship, whether it's business or family, is that it has this powerful way of just changing the way you think and minimizing the impact it has on the families around you. We learn from the lesson of Joseph is that you got to make your family your first priority. Family sometimes starts with one. As a single adult, maybe you've been in a family and you've been separated from that family. You've got to consider the impact of the business on your health and on your life, and you need to now set up some healthy boundaries. It could be that the family that you need to prioritize is a spouse. It could include your children. But the point is that when you've left the family of origin, you now have a responsibility to evaluate its impact on you and how long you're going to allow that impact to continue, which is hard at the holiday season. The pull of family, the pressure of work increases with a magnitude at the Christmas season, which is really amazing. And now you need to put yourself in a position of asking, how long will I allow this impact to continue into my family or into my own life and into my own health? And you have to set up healthy boundaries. Like Joseph, sometimes those healthy boundaries take sacrifice. The sacrifice of being able to put yourself as maybe as a gatekeeper to your family, absorbing the stress and the impact and the anger and the frustration of the people who are trying to manipulate you to get the ends that they want, and you're trying to preserve your family from it. It could be the choice of maybe making a new decision about your career or your job and the transition and the loss of what you've accumulated to that point because what you're in is so unhealthy that its impact on you is damaging. That's not fair. Healthy boundaries aren't always fair, but they're always good. And the thing about making these type of decisions is that you don't always have the ability to make it because when you've been raised in a pattern of behavior or a way of thought, it's hard to think outside that box. And that's when you have to do aspects of going to people for counsel and for help to get some direction on how you can be able to manage this. Because at the holiday seasons, at the Christmas season, part of unpacking the season is managing the conflict that you're going to experience. Managing the conflict that we're going to experience. So I want to take a second through all that we've been talking about. In the midst of all that we've been speaking of, somebody's face may have come to mind. A relationship may have come up. And so we want to give you a minute to get out of the chaos of the holiday, to breathe, and to think. Think of that relationship you're struggling. Maybe it's a healthy relationship and you're just experiencing some conflict with it. Or maybe it's an unhealthy relationship that you're going to try to manage what you're going to do this Christmas. Think of the principles we've learned about managing conflict just from the simple story of Joseph. To get yourself into a good place, to choose the gracious way, to be open to new insights, to embrace the hard work of reconciliation, to prioritize your family, and to set up healthy boundaries. What's one step you can take in the relationship that's in your mind that could help lead you to a healthier place? We're going to give you a minute. This is getting into a healthy place. Coming into a place where God can speak to you. Taking the stories of the Bible, reflecting on them in the context of your life. Processing the relationships where you have conflict, and asking God, what do I do with it? You already did the first step. What will you do when you move on? Because God's presence makes it possible to manage conflict towards good results. When I read the story of Joseph, I skipped a piece. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they'll call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. In the midst of your conflict, in the midst of Joseph's conflict, God was present. Sometimes we think in the conflicted relationships we have that God isn't there, that God is missing, that we're caught helpless in conflict. But whatever the conflict is that you're experiencing, and Joseph had extraordinary conflict in his life, the promise in the center of it all was Emmanuel, God with us. The God present to guide you, to protect you, to speak to you, and to work through you towards a good end. Because you're not on your own. Christmas reminds us that Emmanuel is present in our life to guide us through all of the relationships that we have. That we might be able to unpack Christmas in a way that can lead us to the love, the joy, and the peace that he's promised us. God, I just want to pray that you spoke this morning in a way that was meaningful to people. God, I understand the power of conflict. The way it moves inside of us and disrupts us and makes it hard to think clearly and overwhelms us with emotions. God, I pray that this morning you just kind of blew through all of that and spoke in a way that was insightful and helpful to people. That your Spirit would empower us and fill us with your love to make choices, God, that lead to peace. I pray that your Spirit at work in this place would do immeasurably more than we could ever expect or imagine possible, because Emmanuel is with us even here. Amen.